Horia Onita, welcome. You are the President of the European Students' Union and co-chair on the drafting committee and working group on social dimensions, right? So how was today so far?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me here. I think it's a marvelous initiative that right now we are trying to explain what's happening here in the Bologna process, but also in the Bologna follow-up group, the body that oversees the Bologna process, because along the years it has had a lot of impact in student lives, in the way that higher education systems in Europe have developed and converged towards common goals. But in many cases, it's very difficult to go beyond the technicalities and the legalese and all these, sometimes I admit, looks like very boring processes.
Yes,
so yeah, for sure. Yeah. And today actually we discussed about the draft communique. So in the European higher education area, all the ministers that are part of the EHEA come together once every 2 or 3 years to firstly take stock of what was happening, what we are working on together to improve higher education systems, to create common tools for mobility, for social dimension, for student participation, comparability of degrees, etc., but also to look at the future, so what we want to achieve next. And especially we are in a context where the common European action is needed more than ever, we would say, because we see what's happening around us in society. We are talking about inequality, polarization, we have advances in technology, digitalization, artificial intelligence, we have war still, unfortunately, in our continent. So there is the question, how does higher education respond to this? How we adapt our system for a different society, for a different economy, and what is the role played by higher education system? So concretely, how do we change what students learn, what they are taught, how we assess the student knowledge and competencies, and improve, let's say the overall framework. And today we actually went paragraph by paragraph and said, okay, we have here the representatives of member states, of ministries of education, and they shared their thoughts about what they could commit to or what not, because that's always the thing, especially even more so when we talk about financial commitments. It's difficult to get them to write off different proposals.
But since you were saying that it's all very technical and people don't know a lot of things about it, can you try to explain how does the decision-making process happen within the EHEA, the European Higher Education Area?
Surely. So we have this ministerial conference, which is once every 2 or 3 years, which is the highest decision-making body. But then in between, we have this structure called the Bologna follow-up group, which brings together the representatives of member states, but also stakeholders, students, higher education institutions, academic staff, quality assurance agencies, and we assess the progress in actually making a reality what was committed to, because we can have very shiny communiques and we proclaim that we will have inclusive education, quality education. They all sound very nice, but at the end of the day, the question is, do we actually see a meaningful change at a grassroots level, at the level of students and universities? So we have this Bologna group where the decisions are made by consensus. That's a feature. It's an intergovernmental process. There is no competence at European level. It's just the willing nature of member states to commonly commit to something because it's in their interest to do so, to promote mobility, to promote international cooperation. And this is how Bologna has worked so far. Of course, being a voluntary process means that it is voluntary to commit, but once you commit it, there is a political at least morality there, to responsibility to implement what you committed to. Of course, there is no legal action for it, but nevertheless. And we have different working structures because it would be impossible to discuss all the breadth of the topics we have 2 BFUGs per year. So we have different working structures created by the BFUG, working group on social dimension to create indicators for social dimension, on fundamental values, on learning and teaching, and also other thematic groups to promote, like we have the task force of enhancing knowledge sharing, so how we communicate about Bologna, coordination group group on global policy dialogue, how we communicate and how we interact with other global regions, because Europe doesn't live in a vacuum. We have communication and we should have cooperation with other parts of the globe. So this is the overall structure. We have the BFUG, we have different working structures, and all the member states can take part in this. We also have, and it's very important, we have a structure related to the key commitments, because in Bologna we came to the conclusion that if you do not implement at least a minimum basic of reforms, then you cannot achieve the expected impact. So we are talking about the use of ECTS, about the 3-degree structure, bachelor, master's, PhD. We are talking about recognition procedures, quality assurance. These are the bare minimum, let's call them like that. They may look technical again, but they assure that there is a minimum degree of comparability and compatibility between the higher education systems.
And could you also share in advance the main decisions the BFUG has proposed to the ministers to take?
Sure, they are provisional by this point. That's a caveat to mention, to say so. But right now we are looking at several points of decision. The first one, and that's very important, is on a shared definition and conceptualization of the fundamental values in higher education, because we understand that our processes are guided by some overarching principles: the public responsibility, student and staff participation in governance, academic freedom, academic integrity, especially now with the surge of different tools. People say that for a legitimate reason that academic integrity is at peril, that you cannot distinguish between fake diplomas and legitimate diploma. So we kind of explain in these statements how commonly at European level we understand the implementation of these fundamental values. And why will it matter? It will matter because the countries will be monitored to the degree to which de jure, and so in the legislation, but also de facto, in reality, they comply with these minimum fundamental values for students, for staff, for higher education institutions. We also have different calls by the ministers to revise processes in light of the recent developments. I'm talking here about the standards and guidelines on quality assurance at European level. I'm talking about, right now we were discussing the revision of the ECTS users guide, and also a very important point. In 2020, in the Rome Communique, we agreed on common principles on social dimension, because, and the reality, if we are looking at the data, we still have so many disadvantaged students that do not access higher education, they don't afford it. We have a housing crisis across Europe. We have students complaining that they are admitted to higher education institutions in different parts of Europe, and they literally cannot find a decent housing accommodation. And they are even told, we are sorry, we have nothing to do, come back next year. It's incredible to see these concerns actually materialize. So we have these principles, but we said it's not sufficient. We also need to have some indicators to guide member states, because the principles are high-level political commitments, but we need to go further. So we take all of these 10 principles related to psychological counseling, academic counseling support, lifelong learning, grants, loans, so on and so forth, inclusive learning environments, and we try to translate them in more bits of concrete policy ideas that could be taken by the member states.
Okay, but you're also co-chair of the working group on social dimension. Could you give us an example? What do you think is the biggest achievement of the working group?
Right now, the biggest achievement is that in 2020 we convinced, I would say even now, it's not, let's say, politically the right thing to say, but I'm even surprised that at that point we managed to convince ministers to agree on a broad set of actions. Especially in social dimension, countries are wary, because firstly, it implies money, and secondly, it implies changing mindsets, which is more difficult than just saying we implement a new diploma supplement, or we put in a qualification framework another cycle, etc. This may happen more easily, but changing a mindset towards the social dimension and giving money for this, it's something more difficult to convince, but we have this document and we have data reporting. So it's not like we approve the document and we are happy, we have the document, hooray. We are looking at the impact. There were 2 monitoring rounds from the EURIDICE, from an agency of the European Commission. And we saw concrete progress towards this direction. Far from what we want as students, that's obvious. Nevertheless, there is some incentive for member states. And unfortunately, when you have a non-binding process, a political process, you have 2 means to convince the countries. The first one is through convincing them that the measure is actually bringing added value, and for this we also have our national unions, because the European level is always interconnected with the national level. We have our national unions of students who advocate for these measures at national level, and the second one, we have to say it, is also a bit of a naming and shaming. So if you're really committed to this, then okay, you don't have the resources to achieve it in 2 years, but we want to see at least the intention, so a progress. You are trying, yeah, at least you are trying.
And looking back on these 25 years, what would you say was the biggest improvement that the Bologna process brought to all of us?
I think it is difficult to conceptualize it in one word. I would say mobility, but mobility not only in the sense of improving mobility, which happened, but also changing the systems to be more open to mobility, which also changed the systems for those who didn't want to go to mobility. And here we are talking about the degree structure. So the bachelor, master, PhD, that was a remit of Bologna. The use of learning outcomes. That means that when you are assessed as a student, you need to be assessed against what the intended learning outcomes are. That was a shift from the mnemonic learning and teaching, where unfortunately we still have it in many countries, but nevertheless it's still present. But the idea and the push in this direction, which happened towards an extent, was to promote student-centered learning by moving away from that you need to learn everything by heart and you're going to have an exam and you need to write 5 pages of everything you learned, into actually showing how that you can apply, you can think critically, you can solve problems. And all of this was a consequence of many concerted actions in the Bologna process. Qualification framework, diploma supplement, use of learning outcomes, promotion of the degree structure and what the degree structure means. So it brought a lot of coherence in the system. Before the Bologna process, it was very difficult to move between countries and to have your credits or your degrees recognized, or even to go to the labor market. And right now we are, especially in the EU, but even beyond, we have this concept of freedom of movement and labor mobility. I want to work in another country. It may have taken months or even years, or you may have not had the diploma recognized at all. So the 2 main things that the Bologna process brought were, firstly, this capacity to move more freely, and secondly, a change in the mindset of the higher education institutions into what is the purpose of a degree. The bachelor should be sufficient for going to the labor market. The master should be more research oriented or more for upskilling, and then PhD is fully research. It's not the case everywhere. Again, I want to point this caveat, and especially in Bologna, we need to go a bit back to the basics to see if these basic commitments are in depth, coherently and correctly implemented. But nevertheless, everyone should share in a way the fact that with all the obstacles, we had, at the end of the day, a concrete impact in the Bologna process.
Thank you very much for being with us today. I will let you go back to the working group, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.